Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. When Americans think about World War II, they usually picture Pearl Harbor, Normandy, Iwo Jima, or the skies over Europe. But today, we're going to talk about a front of the war that most history books barely mention. A place where American soil was occupied by enemy forces, where fog, ice, and isolation were as deadly as bullets. This is the story of Japan's hidden plan to take Alaska. In 1942, while the world's attention was fixed on the South Pacific in the Battle for Midway, Imperial Japan launched an operation so bold that if successful, it could have changed the strategic balance of the war in the Pacific. Japanese troops landed and held a territory that was legally part of the United States. For nearly a year, the rising sun flew over American land. How did this happen? Why Alaska? And how close did Japan come to turning the far north into a permanent battlefield? To understand this, we must step back to the months following Pearl Harbor. After December 7, 1941, Japan was riding a wave of victories. The Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies were falling one by one. Japanese leaders believed the United States had been psychologically crippled and that one more decisive blow could force Washington to negotiate. But Japan faced a serious strategic problem: distance. The vastness of the Pacific meant that American aircraft carriers and long-range bombers could eventually threaten the Japanese home islands. Alaska, stretching like a bridge between North America and Asia, suddenly became critically important. From the Aleutian Islands, American bombers could one day reach northern Japan. Japanese submarines already operated in these waters, and Tokyo knew the U.S. Navy would not ignore this northern approach forever. Japanese naval planners called this the Northern Shield. Their goal was not simply conquest, but denial, preventing the United States from using Alaska as a staging ground for attacks on Japan. By occupying key Aleutian Islands, Japan hoped to extend its defensive perimeter, disrupt American supply lines, and force the U.S. Navy to fight on multiple fronts. In early 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto approved a coordinated operation. While the main Japanese fleet would strike at Midway, a secondary force would move north toward Alaska. This was not a diversion in the casual sense. It was a calculated gamble designed to stretch American defenses to their breaking point. American intelligence, however, largely underestimated the northern threat. The Aleutians were seen as remote, inhospitable, and strategically insignificant. U.S. bases were underdeveloped, weather reconnaissance was poor, and commanders believed Japan would never commit serious forces to such a harsh environment. That assumption would soon prove dangerously wrong. By late spring of 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft were already preparing to strike Dutch Harbor, Alaska's main military installation. At the same time, invasion forces were assembling for landings on two isolated islands that few Americans could even pronounce: Attu and Kiska. What followed would become the only campaign of World War II fought on American soil, a campaign buried under fog, secrecy, and decades of historical neglect. And that is where our story truly begins. In the next stage, we'll examine Japan's Aleutian Strike Force, the attack on Dutch Harbor, and the moment the war quietly reached the shores of the United States. Stay with us. In early June of 1942, the people of Alaska had no idea that their homeland was about to become a battlefield. At the time, Alaska was still a U.S. territory, sparsely populated and poorly defended. The Aleutian Islands stretched for over 1,000 miles into the North Pacific. A chain of volcanic rock, constant fog, brutal winds, and freezing rain. To many in Washington, they seemed irrelevant. To the Japanese Navy, they were a doorway. On June 3, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft appeared out of the mist above Dutch Harbor, the primary American naval and air base in the Aleutians. The attack was carried out by planes launched from the aircraft carriers Ryujo and Junyo, part of Vice Admiral Bushiro Hosogaya's Northern Area Force. For most Americans, this attack has been overshadowed by the Battle of Midway, which unfolded almost simultaneously. But for Alaska, this was a shock unlike anything before. Japanese bombers and fighters struck fuel tanks, barracks, and defensive positions. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but confusion and poor visibility worked in Japan's favor. Several U.S. installations were damaged, and more importantly, the psychological barrier was shattered. The continental United States had been attacked again. The raid on Dutch Harbor was not designed to destroy the base completely. Its purpose was strategic distraction and reconnaissance. Japanese planners wanted to confirm American defenses, tie down U.S. forces, and cover the next phase of the operation, the occupation of the Aleutian Islands. The following day, June 4th, Japanese aircraft returned. Once again, bombs fell on American soil. By the end of the raids, dozens of Americans were dead or wounded, aircraft destroyed, and critical infrastructure damaged. Civilian residents, many of them native Alaskans, were suddenly living in an active war zone. But the air raids were only the beginning. While American commanders focused on defending Dutch Harbor, Japanese invasion forces moved quietly through the fog toward their real objectives. On June 6, 1942, Japanese troops landed on Kiska Island. 2 days later, they landed on Attu. There was almost no resistance. The islands were lightly defended, with only small weather and radio stations. Japanese forces quickly secured both islands, raising the imperial flag over territory that was legally part of the United States. For the first and only time during World War II, American land was under foreign occupation. From Tokyo's perspective, the operation was a success. Japan had extended its defensive perimeter, disrupted American planning, and forced the U.S. military to divert resources northward at a critical moment in the war. The Aleutians became a thorn in America's side, remote, difficult to supply, and extremely costly to retake. For American leaders, the shock was profound. Newspapers downplayed the occupation to avoid public panic, but behind the scenes, the War Department scrambled. Bases were expanded, troops rushed north, and Alaska was suddenly transformed from a forgotten frontier into a strategic priority. Yet reclaiming the Aleutians would not be simple. The enemy was entrenched, the terrain was hostile, and the weather, relentless fog, freezing rain, and violent storms, would soon prove deadlier than Japanese bullets. In the next stage, we'll explore life under occupation on Attu and Kiska, Japan's true intentions in Alaska, and why this northern campaign became one of the most miserable and misunderstood battles of the entire war. By the summer of 1942, the unthinkable had happened. Japanese soldiers were digging in on American territory. On the islands of Attu and Kiska, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy began fortifying their positions almost immediately. What they found was not fertile land or strategic harbors, but one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Aleutians were cold, wet, and perpetually shrouded in fog. Winds howled at hurricane strength. Visibility could drop to zero without warning. Yet Japan was determined to hold these islands. On Attu, a small population of Aleut civilians, fewer than 50 people, were taken prisoner. They were eventually transported to Japan, where many died in captivity due to disease and malnutrition. This remains one of the least discussed civilian tragedies of the Pacific War. On Kiska, there were no civilians, but the island quickly became a fortress. Japanese engineers constructed bunkers, tunnels, artillery positions, and underground shelters carved directly into volcanic rock. Supplies were brought in by submarine and fast transport ships, often under cover of fog and darkness. Japanese commanders never intended Alaska to be invaded in full. There was no plan to march south toward Anchorage or Seattle. Instead, the Aleutian occupation was meant to serve three purposes: block American air and naval operations in the North Pacific, protect Japan's northern flank from a U.S. or Soviet approach, force the United States to divert men, ships, and aircraft away from the Central Pacific. In this, Japan succeeded, at least temporarily. The U.S. military now faced a brutal dilemma. Every soldier sent north was one less soldier fighting in Guadalcanal. Every ship assigned to Alaska was unavailable elsewhere. And yet, leaving enemy forces on American soil was politically unacceptable. As months passed, the Aleutians became a war of attrition. American bombers launched repeated raids from newly constructed bases, but weather often prevented accurate targeting. Aircraft crashed into mountains or vanished into the sea. Frostbite, trench foot, and exposure claimed more lives than combat. One U.S. officer would later describe the Aleutian campaign with a single word: misery. By early 1943, Washington had reached a decision. The Aleutians would be retaken, at any cost, and the first target would be Attu. On May 11, 1943, American forces landed on Attu Island. What they encountered was not a weak outpost, but a determined and well-prepared enemy. Japanese troops under Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki had used the island's rugged terrain to their advantage. They avoided beaches and instead fortified the high ground, forcing U.S. troops to fight uphill through mud, snow, and freezing rain. The battle quickly turned into a nightmare. Visibility was poor, maps were inaccurate, radios failed in the cold. Soldiers often couldn't see the enemy, only feel the sudden impact of machine gun fire from hidden positions. The terrain was so unforgiving that tanks were useless. Artillery struggled to find targets. Combat devolved into small unit engagements, fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets at close range. Casualties mounted rapidly. By the end of May, American forces had suffered thousands of losses, not only from combat, but from exposure, disease, and accidents. Japanese defenders, isolated and undersupplied, fought with the knowledge that there would be no evacuation. On May 29, 1943, Colonel Yamasaki launched a final Banzai charge, one of the largest of the war. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers rushed American positions in a desperate last-ditch assault. By dawn, the battle was over. Attu had been reclaimed, but at a terrible cost. Of the roughly 2,300 Japanese defenders, almost none survived. American losses exceeded 3,800 casualties. It was the bloodiest battle ever fought on North American soil, and yet one enemy stronghold still remained: Kiska. After Attu, American planners expected Kiska to be even worse. Reconnaissance showed extensive fortifications. Japanese radio traffic continued. Submarine sightings suggested resupply efforts. Everything pointed to a bloody second invasion. In August 1943, a massive Allied force, including American and Canadian troops, landed on Kiska and found nothing. The Japanese were gone. Under cover of dense fog in late July 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy had executed a daring evacuation. In a matter of hours, more than 5,000 troops were removed from Kiska without the Allies realizing it. It was a stunning success. But the danger wasn't over. Expecting fierce resistance, Allied troops advanced cautiously and paid the price. Mines, booby traps, friendly fire incidents, and harsh weather caused hundreds of casualties, even though not a single Japanese soldier remained on the island. The Aleutian campaign ended not with a decisive victory, but with exhaustion and confusion, and with a sobering realization. The Northern War had drained lives and resources far out of proportion to its size. Japan's Aleutian operation was bold, but ultimately flawed. The occupation of Attu and Kiska stretched Japanese supply lines to their limit. Every soldier, every bullet, every ration had to cross vast storm-ridden seas. Submarines could only deliver so much. Air support was inconsistent. Reinforcement was nearly impossible. More importantly, the strategic payoff was limited. The Aleutians never became a launching point for Japanese expansion. Instead, they became a trap, forcing Japan to defend remote, inhospitable territory while losing momentum elsewhere in the Pacific. Meanwhile, the United States adapted. New bases were built. Cold weather warfare techniques improved. Alaska became a heavily fortified region that Japan could no longer threaten. What began as a bold defensive maneuver ended as a costly distraction. Today, the Aleutian Islands are quiet. Fog still rolls in. The wind still howls. Rusting remnants of bunkers and airstrips are slowly reclaimed by nature. Yet this forgotten battlefield carries a powerful legacy. Japan did not simply bomb Alaska. It occupied it. American soldiers fought and died on U.S. soil. Civilians were taken prisoner. And for nearly a year, the outcome of the war in the North Pacific was uncertain. The Aleutian campaign reminds us that World War II was truly global, reaching even the coldest, most remote corners of the map. And it reminds us that history doesn't always unfold where we expect it to. If you found this story valuable, don't forget to subscribe, share, and join us as we continue exploring the hidden chapters of World War II. Thank you for watching.